Okay, hello and welcome. We're going to be covering NetLab 19 using vSphere High Availability, and this is part of the VMware vSphere 6.0 Install, Configure, Manage labs. So let's take a look at what's involved in this lab. So this lab is providing detailed guidance on performing lab21 from the lab manual using vSphere High Availability of the vSphere 6.0 ICM course. And the objective is to demonstrate vSphere HA or high availability functionality. In this lab, we'll be using the V client to complete our objectives as usual. And we're going to perform the following tasks. One, we're going to create a cluster enabled for VMware HA, high availability. Number two, we're going to add the host to a lab cluster. 3, we're going to test VMware high availability functionality. And 4, we're going to view the vSphere HA cluster resource usage. As just a reminder, here is our lab topology. We can see the pods. We have the V client right over here. And through that, we're connecting to our vCenter server. And we see that we have 2 ESXi hosts, ESXi1 and ESXi2, and those are connected to a backend data center, or data store. It's really a SAN array. All right. Okay, so we're going to get started. So we need to click, we need to open up that V client and use the web browser to access the vCenter server at 172.16.1.1, ignoring, of course, the warning page, and logging into the browser. And once we do so, using the username of admin and the password of VMware, we're going to click on the Hosts and Clusters tab. When we do that, in the Object Navigator, we're going to create a new cluster. As you see, we have the existing lab cluster, so we'll create a new cluster by right-clicking on the training data center. And then we'll use that new cluster wizard to create a cluster called Node Cluster Demo. We're going to turn on the high availability. And we want to enable the host monitoring, admission control, and then we'll make sure that we set the percentage of cluster resources to 25% for CPU, 25% for memory. And then what we want to do is ensure that the VM monitoring is disabled. And when we complete that, we'll be able to click that node cluster demo, and we're actually going to delete it and then remove that. We'll actually work with the lab cluster. So we don't really need that. That was just an example of how to create one. So let's kind of go through that now. Okay, so here we are in the vCenter server, and we're going to create a cluster that's enabled for vSphere high availability, knowing that we're going to need to throw it away when we're all done. We're going to delete that. So we'll go to our hosts and clusters, click on that, and that should expose our training data center here. And we're going to right-click on that, and you can see that we have the new cluster action right here. So go ahead and select that one there. All right, in the new cluster window, we're going to name this, and if you recall, we were going to name this Node Cluster Demo. Select the vSphere High Availability by clicking the Turn On button, and that'll expose all of our options down here. Notice that Enable Host Monitoring is already selected for us. That ensures that our ESXi hosts can monitor each other, and if one of them drops out of the cluster, we can have some we should be notified. Enable admission control. So this is going to prevent powering on any virtual machines that violate any availability constraints, meaning that there aren't enough resources. So we're going to set an availability constraint. We're going to set a policy here. So we're going to specify the type of policy that the admission control should enforce. So currently it's set to host failures cluster tolerates 1. let's change that, and we're going to set it by percentage instead of by the number of hosts. Well, let's take a look at that for a moment. Notice that you could actually change this. You can say, you know what, host failure cluster tolerates, say, 4, or we could set it to 3, but the default was set to 1. We're going to set it to percentage of cluster resources reserved as failover spare capacity. And we can go ahead and leave this at 25%. So basically what we're saying here is that we need to reserve 25% of our CPU and 25% of our memory in our cluster, meaning of all the hosts. If we pool together all their CPU and all their memory, we need to set aside 25% of both of those values for failover, meaning that if we need to bring online another virtual machine, we need to make sure that there are enough resources available. And so this is going to limit the ability to deploy a virtual machine if we don't have this capacity. Notice that VM monitoring is disabled. If you hit the drop-down menu, you can see that we can set it to VM monitoring only, or we can monitor both VM and application monitoring. So this simply allows us to establish whether or not we're going to be monitoring individual VMs and not just hosts. Also notice that we have EVC, which is currently disabled. More on that later. And virtual SAN, that's also disabled. All right, when we're done, we're going to hit the OK. And we should see a new cluster. And you can see that the cluster has been created on the training data center. If I expand this, we should see our node cluster demo. And then if we expand this, you'll see that currently there are no hosts in our node cluster. Also, if I click, this will give me some details about it. So currently the target is training, and the result is a node cluster demo. These were all created. This was created. All right, so that's done. So our next step, since we've done that, and we're not actually going to use it, but if we were, we would need to assign hosts to that cluster. So if we right click on the node cluster demo, we can select add hosts. And this would allow us to put in the name or IP address and add that to that. Also, if we're at click, we can say move hosts into cluster, which is a different task. In this case, we're actually moving our hosts that are currently available in our data center and moving them into that. So the difference between the two is quite simply, if we're going to add a host that's currently not part of our data center, maybe we brought online a couple of new hosts specifically for that, and this is moving hosts that are currently in the data center. If we expose the lab cluster, we can see that that currently does not have any hosts in it as well. All right, our last task here is to actually remove this cluster. So we'll go ahead and right click on the cluster, and you'll see that we have the delete right here. So we'll select that. And it just simply warns me that if I remove this, it's going to remove all the clusters, hosts, and virtual machines from the inventory. So you really got to be careful with something like this. So we'll go ahead and delete it since there isn't anything there anyways. And we're good to go. We can see that it's no longer available in here. All right, that ends this demonstration. We'll come back and we'll pick up from here. The next step is to look at configuring host environments to support VMware high availability, since that is the purpose of the clustering in this activity.